So
Right.
thanks a lot for having me the opportunity to present again
We're
today.
excited to have you.
Yeah, and to everybody who's joining in on this call. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Go back on this and make sure everything works okay. And I think it should. Okay, Gay?
Yep, looks great.
All right. So what I wanted to do is to kind of take you across the northern Bering all the way up to Tiavik and to talk about what some of the changes that we're seeing and also what's been happening as far as cruises and some of the limitations and those that are going into the water. But some of this, I think everybody probably knows, the reduction in sea ice is allowing a lot warmer seawater. And these are changing different trophic levels in the Pacific Arctic. So I'm going to say a few things on that. Including the biological changes and some of the relationships of the predator-prey. So I am a biological oceanographer, and I'm interested in animals that live in and on the sediments. So I'm interested in food for like gray whales, walruses, bearded seals, diving sea ducks. But we'll go forward from there. I'm also going to present some new information on some of the signatures in the sediments that are telling us what's happening in the overlying water column and how that might influence those animals. And then I'll give you a few updates on ongoing projects. So for the next slide, where's this thing? Here we are. And so I think most people have heard me before. I put this in the context of this observing system that we have as a network both nationally and internationally. The Pacific Arctic, as you know, there's a strong connection between what goes on the surface and what happens under the underlying sediments because it's so shallow. In the northern Bering Chukchi, we're talking anywhere from 40 to 60 meters. So what grows in the upper water column settles down to the benthos pretty fast, separated by, you have zooplankton and so now fish moving northward also consuming some of those plankton and also the benthic organisms. The whole thing is a change detection array. And normally we would have 6 to 10 of different cruises, and we are lucky actually to have some of our international colleagues that have put in 3-month cruises coming from Japan and Korea that are up working. Canada is working in the northern part of north of the Beaufort Sea right now. But it has been limited due to COVID. And so all of these cruises, most of them are all starting outside of Alaska, be it in the foreign countries or starting the Dyson, for example, that just came back from Noah's cruise, started in Seattle. So it's making for longer cruises, but it also makes it safer for participants coming into Alaska and particularly to the coastal communities. So one of the things I would point out, and I think Gabe will mention that at the end of this Dyson cruise, it was 40 days. They were looking at along primarily the water column work because of an issue we had with COVID for doing the benthic and sediment sampling, which we are going to be able to do now on the Norseman 2, starting tomorrow. But I would point out just a few things that the warmer, that Phyllis will say is that the water was warmer up to 3 degrees on the bottom, higher than they have on the normal range in the Bering Sea, beyond what the warmer temperatures that we're seeing all the way from the Bering into the Chukchi. And then, as I said, we will be going on the Norseman, and I'll say a few words about that. So if you go, this is comes from the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, and this is just the Bering Sea, taking you for average surface temperatures May through October, from the 1900 all the way up to 2019. And I would just point out the last time we had these warmer surface waters on average was back in the 1920 period. We had that cold period, but now we're on a trajectory of warming and warming waters, which means it's harder to build ice in the wintertime. It shortens the amount of time to do that. So the blue are the coldest years, the reds are the 10 warmest years that are on. Then I'd also just what's happening today. You can see where the ice is. It's an amazing, it's the second lowest ice pullback on record. The last one was the 2011-12 season. And this is up in the, just point this out, this hole right in the center. But this is the last remnant. Now the ice is starting to build up again. But with some of the multi-year ice up here, wide open on the Bering and Chukchi Seas and all along the Beaufort coastline with that. And so the air temperatures, as you probably all know who live in Alaska, are above normal in the western and northern part. But the water temperatures from the north of the Chukchi and southern Beaufort are actually cooler than parts of it for the past certain parts of the region, but not every part of the region. So that might influence the ice forming quicker. That was a statement today until I talked to Gay, and we talked about this really warm water in the northwest area. So that will play into keeping that system warmer. And then I just converted these. This is the sea surface temperature from yesterday, on the average being 4 and 5 off of Nome here, and then and just moved it into Fahrenheit. So we're still having a lot of open water and no ice in this area, and that won't come back until later into the winter. So the importance of the food is, let's see if I can move this out of here. Yeah, is a food for the benthos. On the left there is something that Rolf Grodinger put together in his team. It's basically showing, the permanent ice cap. It's a conceptual model. The under ice production that goes on here, so you can get under ice fauna growing on that plankton in the under ice. Then the ice edge bloom, and a lot of that material settling down to the benthos, particularly in the springtime before the zooplankton starts to grow faster and consume that. So this is something that Sue Moore and Phil Stabenow put together on the BOEM-funded SOAR special issue on the synthesis of Arctic research. This is kind of a conceptual model we've been working on for years, but basically the benthic dominated. It's something that is in the past, in the sense that it's still there and it's still a dominant part, but we're losing some of that early season ice algae and moving more into what we would forecast to be more of a pelagic system. So organisms on the water column and less food down below for the benthos. What that would mean is that the losers may well be the animals that feed off of the benthos on the bottom, and the winners would be more the zooplankton and fish feeders. This is an extreme, and it's a conceptual model, and regionally it's happening at different levels. So what happens with warming temperatures? You get the change in the spring sea ice retreat, and that underlying, we can reduce that under ice production over here. That is kind of the first kickoff for a lot of these animals for beginning their reproductive cycles, and also for providing that first bulk deposition of food. So if you cut that out and you don't have the sea ice, you have less food overall on an annual basis. You do, and depending on timing, you have to have sunlight still, and you have to have nutrients to kick off that open water production. The other thing that happens with warming temperatures is you get that increase in zooplankton growth, abundance, and grazing. So that's up here with this conceptual model here, that they'll start grazing down a lot of that material, which means the net loss down to the underlying sediments. So this would limit those food for the benthic animals. So this is actually a map that shows you how we built the observing system back starting in 2010, although the data sets have been accumulating for the last 30 years from various science programs, starting back with Russian colleagues back in the 50s and Sam Stoker in the 70s, and I can go on, Arnie Blanchard and others working on that. But what we put together in the synthesis was to show these areas, which are DBO 1, 2 in the Chirikov, 3, the southern Chukchi, 4 up in the northeast Chukchi, and then into Barrow Canyon here. And since it's a benthic system, the background bright colors here, the darker the color, the higher the biomass. So these have been converted to carbon. And so just to give you an idea, when you see something that says 40, that's like 4,000 grams wet weight. It's quite a dramatic amount of food, which is why you have a lot of benthic animals that feed off of like gray whales or walruses that bulk feed off of these big patches in the benthos. And so these are some of the footprints that we're seeing, and we track these. We do this as time series measurements annually and seasonally. But we're fortunate now to have, during the time that Seth's team had the Asgard funding through NPRB, they had sediment traps in 2 and 3. Moorings. There's a sediment trap going in on the current cruise, along with moorings down in this DBO1 area. That's from Phyllis Stabenow. The ones up here, Seth has the Chukchi Ecosystem Observatory in this region. And so there are other moorings throughout this. So we not only do we have moorings that give us inner seasonal or monthly values, we have our ship going, plus also there's gliders, and I think that'll become another talk that's in the water now, in fact, in which they're looking at different physical parameters and also measurements, and some of these moorings have sound for looking at marine mammals. And these are just castocheric. These are some of the clams, amphipods that gray whales feed on, worms that actually cod are feeding on, the polar cod, excuse me, not the polar cod, Pacific cod here, sipunculids, and then the sea cucumbers. So I think that you've seen this map before, but I think an important thing to point out is with the opening of that pullback of sea ice, the gray whales are going further north. They're still feeding in the central Chirikov. They're feeding south of St. Lawrence, but they don't spend as much time because they can go up and find feeding areas up into the northeast Chukchi Sea, as well as going into the Beaufort and over to the Bathurst Polynya in the eastern part of the Beaufort. So this is the gray whales feeding here, but not only are they feeding on benthic animals, this is a small amphipod. You can, if you put 10,000 straws into a meter squared, that's what it used to be 30 years ago, and they were seeing declines in that population of this very lipid-rich organism that the gray whales like to feed on. But they also will feed on the euphausids, and so not only are the bowheads feeding on euphausids, but the gray whales can feed them when they're near the bottom. Walruses, they're losing the platform for sea ice. They're being impacted by prey. This is just stomach contents from a collaborator, a local observer, subsistence hunter in Diomede. And then the diving sea ducks. So they're losing their ice platform. They have to spend more energy in the water than they would normally. And so they're losing they're getting less energy storage as fat over time because they're spending more having to rest in water than they are on ice. So this is just a few examples of what we're seeing here. This is now southwest of St. Lawrence Island. There's a Polynya, which is an open area and ice-covered sea. Just taking the 2000 to 2015 period. We are expanding this, and we'll have that graphic out by the end of the year. But the trend is that we're declining in the clams in the south, and which are the purple, and getting more of the marine worms. So you have a Pacific cod like to eat those marine worms. So it does provide a prey base for the fish population that is actually moving more northward, but they're not a common food particularly for diving ducks. And this is the area further north. So this is one indication of the change that we're seeing, a contraction of these Arctic animals in north in these time series. If you look at the same thing and you go to north of St. Lawrence Island now and look at the change in colors over the last 4 decades, there's just a contraction and a reduction in the number of our time series sites with these nice nutrient lipid-rich amphipods. And instead, some of these areas will be taken over by marine worms and also by clams, which are the brown here. So in this particular case, the worms are in yellow, pink are these amphipods. And it's that footprint change, the contraction is also being seen. There's still rich areas on the eastern side. There's a front between the Alaska coastal water here, which is warmer and more nutrient poor after the spring production, and the Pacific, more Pacific nutrient-rich water that's colder. These animals prefer those colder temperatures on the bottom. And so this was this northward direction of this core biomass is being seen, different species, same environmental response on that. And then these more changes on the outside of getting more of these polychaetes and some of these bivalves that are in there. So there's winners for the walruses, and perhaps we know for sculpins, they like to eat this type of polychaete here, worm. But for the animals like gray whales, their patch is getting smaller, but they're being able to expand their range. If you move into north of Bering Strait now, up in this region here, I just would point out if Rebecca Woodgate, who just finished having her data collected and has these moorings replaced in Bering Strait, the water's warmer and there's currents are faster on certain parts of that. So that is playing into changing transport conditions and that warmer water going into the Chukchi Sea. So on these particular time series here, again, they're really dominated by these clams, almost 80% that are consumed by primarily the walruses in this region here, but also bearded seals. But I want to point out that the water column has a lot, has bowheads feeding. It will have gray whales feeding near the bottom. Fin whales are coming into the system. Humpback whales are coming into the system. So there's still a lot of food and zooplankton in this. So we have a whole group of different trophic level feeders occupying a region here. And then they go off and proceed going north, or primarily, and some of them may proceed going back south. But they are a lot of time, they used to normally follow the ice, which many of them do, the bowheads do, but the other ones are staying and feeding and then proceeding northward. So what we're seeing, this change that we're seeing is over the last 5 years, is this really high increase in the biomass. So that's like you are what you eat. So there's a lot higher chlorophyll content, primary production occurring in the southeast area, more time being open. So as long as you pump nutrients and you get stability coming in here and you have sunlight, you can produce the amount of food that phytoplankton, that both zooplankton in the water column that then can be eaten by pelagic feeders, as well as material going, and a lot of it going down to the sediments. And you can see where the bivalves are really increased over the last years. And this would actually be maintaining a similar type thing as we move out in the last couple of years. So this is something we put together on the synthesis. These are the declines we're seeing, just to give you a trend. In the DBO1 area, which is south of St. Lawrence Island, we're getting this declines in the southern part of it, and more so of the clams. There's no statistic difference in the changes in the northern part of that system. A little variance here because we have an east-west versus a south-north system, but we are having areas that you can see out of the 4 time series stations the trend is down, except for this area on the eastern part of the Chirikov Basin time series. And then as you move from UTN1, which basically this is going from south to north, so you're going from just north of Bering Strait up to off a point further offshore from Point Hope, and you can really see the significant increases of the biomass. So this, where we're declining here, we're getting this punch northward on a lot of the prey for some of these benthic feeding animals.
Jackie, this is Gay. I just want to go back one slide to that. So just to reiterate for people who may not be familiar with these station names, so the DB01, the orange results graph, is south of St. Lawrence Island.
That's right.
Yeah. And then the yellow gold one, so it looks like they're going down. The large animals that live on the seafloor are going down in general. And then in the yellow, that's north of St. Lawrence Island to Diomede is DBO2, right around in there.
Diomede would be right in here, Gay. These are right in the smack center, due west of Nome and those time series sites. Yeah, and then when you go through Bering Strait here, then you get into the southeast Chukchi Sea, and these are it's a latitudinal, it takes you right up to the hot spot, which is offshore on our DBO3 site. So these are part of the DBO3 region.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet. And I guess the correction, I need to put a map right there to make that easier. And this is you don't need to let me put it, this is a little complicated, but this paper just came out today by our PhD student. And I think what's important about it is it's showing how we can use the sediments to trace the sea ice algae in those surface sediments. And it's with a chemical, it's a proxy, which means it's an indicator. It only is carried by certain sea ice species. It comes into the organic carbon, which settles down to the sediments. And when it gets to the sediments, then there's a record that's maintained there. And so what you're looking at and why they're purple are the southern ones, so the DBO1, 2, 3, that actually means there's more less sea ice being deposited there. Most of the sea ice that's coming down in the water column is in the northeast, where is the remnant of our sea ice, except obviously right now. But in the retraction of the retraction of sea ice that happens, you can see what we're trying to show is that this is an indicator of sea ice over, and we're looking at this over time. This is an indicator, the low sea ice, less ice algal production, more sea ice, more ice algal production in the north. And over what you're seeing here, what is the opposite, this is more of the pelagic. So this means there's less pelagic here. Most of the, there's pelagic measurements of this open water production here. And then this is the important one, I think, here. These are the DBOs. You can see DBO 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's easier to understand that sympagic means associated with ice. So it's an ice algal. So if it's more purple and blue, those cooler colors, that indicates you've got more of this index there, means more ice algae. And that's, again, recorded in the sediments in the northeast part. So that's in the DBO 4 and 5. There was a line by Icy Cape we did as part of our joint work with NOAA in 2018. And it really shows how the sediments are really indicative of having more of the pelagic carbon that gets down. What gets down there is not as much as the ice. Used to be ice algae here with the polynya. And because there's less sea ice now, there's way more signatures of pelagic production getting down than you do with the sea ice. So the retraction of the sea ice is also being recorded in the sediments by the percentage of this marker. So what does that mean? Just so to show you that that's an impact on what type of food the type of benthic animals get. And what's important is not all the statements here, except to get the color coding. DBO1, there was no ice. In 2018, if you remember, there really was no ice, very little south of St. Lawrence Island. The polynya didn't form. There were less than 30 days of sea ice compared to 150, which was the traditional amount. And with that, you can see that in the animals. So these animals are not incorporating sea ice algae, which is usually that really lipid-rich kickstart that you would get in the spring. And that is something we're tying in with the declines that we're seeing in some of those populations of benthic animals. If you go up to DBO3, that's the green one, that's north of Bering Strait. And if you go from this southwest, and if you go northeast here, this is latitudinally. So you're going off of Icy Cape, and then you're going up to the 4 and 5. So this is the area where we have most of the ice algae production that's making it down to the bottom to influence and is being recorded in those animals. So then you might ask, well, okay, so what does that mean? So we looked at the feeding strategy. She did. And what we're saying is that most of the animals that are DBO1, and you can see the color coding, there's some suspension, but there's deposit feeders. And then as you go from south to north and you start going up to northeast Chukchi Sea and off into Barrow, you see that the increase is the suspension feeders in here. And these animals, both suspension and the deposit feeders, are picking up that ice algae. And the reason that they're picking up because it sits on the surface, and also they can suspension feed. And these are the clams and different types of animals. So the different feeding strategies will influence, each animal has or dominant ones have a different type of feeding strategy. And we're able to then evaluate which ones are, if they're faster currents, they're suspension feeders. If they're lower currents, they tend to be more of these deposit feeders. And that influences the type of carbon they get, which then is having an impact on their how much bulk feeding they can do and the type of carbon they incorporate and how much they can grow. And then I just wanted to end up, I've shown this slide before, but I think it's important particularly since Gay deals with the ice seals, the unusual mortality events, and the fact that it's ecosystem wide. So we have gray whale die-offs, especially in 219, but there are strandings going on still. Sue Moore has a lead on that one. Then we have and you can see what happened in 219 compared to the 18-year running average. And why that is happening, uncertain. Is it because there's not enough food in their breeding ground? Well, they don't feed mainly, they feed up here in the north. So what are the culprits? Is it the warming water? Is it the predation, or is it impact of the prey? And I've been having discussions again this week to look at some changes of the prey population on these amphipods that may well be causing changes, and what these animals that are up there, are they bulk feeding enough to be able to make it all the way back down to Baja California? Some of them are just staying up in Alaska, and are they utilizing those prey patches? The other one is this increased Ic mortality. This all happened in 2019, and I believe, if I'm not wrong, Gay, you could correct me, that these are still unusual mortality events are still in play here. Same thing with seabirds. I would point out that on the Dyson cruise that just finished, the 40-day cruise of NOAA's, Charlie Wright was from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, did not see any, any carcasses from birds, but it was a bigger ship, as well as gray whales, anything to that nature. And not only that, they didn't see much of the debris that seems to be washing up along the coastline. So we'll be on a smaller vessel starting tomorrow, and then we'll have an opportunity. We will definitely be looking at all types of things on the water and potential impacts for these, particularly both biological as well as trash. So this is another one. So we have stressors now playing into the changes that we're seeing in the biology too. We know that ocean acidification is going on seasonally in certain areas of the Chukchi, as well as south of St. Lawrence Island, and that can have an impact on clams. Some clams can keep their shells, have an ability to regulate, and they aren't thinning their shells out. Others look like the acidification is causing the thinning of those shells. Jessica across from NOAA is looking at, this is the corrosive. If you get a lot of organic carbon on there, you get stratification, a lot of that will go, you get low, higher CO2, cold waters can take up more gas, and so it makes it more acidic on the water, so it becomes more corrosive. And this happens to be an important area for these walrus feeding on the clams that are there. But there looks like there's a resilience. Some certain clams will go out, are impacted, and other ones are not. And then this one, I think you probably have had discussions on before, but the harmful algal blooms, we did those collections that were done on the water column. On the Dyson, we'll be looking at cysts in the sediments on the current cruise that we're looking at. And what you're seeing here is actually, Don Anderson has a project, Bob Picard has a cruise, they'll be doing some work, and mainly next year, because they couldn't take the Healy out. The Healy had issues, as you know, but also with their engine failures, but also because of the COVID issue has really limited the number of and long-term cruises coming out in the region. But the point is that these cysts, this production that goes on with these dinoflagellates, settle out, they're down in the surface sediments. When the waters warm up in the situation, which we're getting now, more warming water on the bottom, they can then release them back into the water column, come up to the surface, and you can have these blooms. And so one of the things that you've probably seen this too is there's a whole collaboration going on and a project that was funded, EcoHab. So looking at the food webs in Alaska, you can see all the cast of characters of collaborators. We did collect things on the next slide. You'll see from our cruises on the Healy. We will continue to do that now on this cruise that's coming up. So there's a whole consortium, a state and federal, local collections working to try to get a better understanding of what the impacts are on these harmful algal blooms and the toxins they have into the prey base, as well as into the food supply for local subsistence activities. So one example is the fact that we collected these clams on our cruise that we did on this one was actually 219 on the Healy. We have a joint program through NOAA and different through DC as well as in PMEL. And we occupied all of these stations and collected sediments and also collected dominant fauna. We will do this again now, and then they were run, and these are the sites for the these were clams that had higher levels that of concern for human consumption. And these are offshore in this area where there's a bloom up here off of the west of north of Lisburn, up in this region in here, Ledyard Bay, and also in the area in the Chirikov here where these animals were collecting. So a lot of this material It looks like the cysts that are here probably were advected for some regions that from south, because a lot of this flow is from south to north, and you get like a conveyor belt. So things, production goes here, we can get settling in the Chirikov, production here, settle up here. Similarly, it moves, so there's this conveyor belt that goes all the way from the northern Bering into the Chukchi northeast. And then you can see some of the sampling that we also did on the slope region. So there's this important accumulation. We will look for these cysts again. And you can see where they found here during that cruise, there was a bloom going on, this bright red color here in Ledyard Bay. And then these cysts, you can look here, will settle down and be in the sediments. And then they're consumed by these clams. The final point I would, because one of the things we'll be doing on this cruise is turning the Chukchi Ecosystem Observatory, and Seth Danielson's on the line here. The work that we're going to be doing, part of this, as well as with the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, which interfaces with the DBO and the consortium of these type of time series measurements that are being done. So as part of AMBON, we're actually going to be looking at DNA, eDNA of some of the water column. We'll be doing a full suite of measurements for that. But on this mooring, I point this out because it not only does it have the moorings, which gives us temperature and salinity and currents, it has sound for marine mammals, recorders for that, discrete water sampling on here, but it also has a sediment trap, which is something we're going to be putting south of St. Lawrence Island on this cruise too. So now we'll have 2 long-term sites south of St. Lawrence Island and the northeast Chukchi Sea, which will have a full suite of physical, chemical, and biological measurements. I would like to just point out here the Arctic cod. This is what they're out of this acoustic backscatter, and they can Kate Stafford at a UW looking at some of the recordings of sounds. But here's the cod all the way up into the this is Arctic cod here, but there's also the Pacific cod, where you all have heard from other speakers, I'm sure, that you're seeing that in the northern Bering Sea and into the Chukchi now, which is a commercial fish. And then this is just an example, Catherine Lalonde, who is also involved in the sediment trap, both here in the CEO and on the DBO1 area. What's great about these sediment traps is you see the zooplankton work in here, and then you can also, oh, I gotta stop. You can see, you can get a time series coming on, which is really great. And what's really important, I think, is you see a lot of this material in the summertime. But look what's happening. This is September, October, November, December. You're still having some, before these zooplankton, they're being advected northward out of the system. So there's different, this is the real production time in July and August, but we get a lot of resuspension coming on over the fall and early winter period. And so this is just, you don't have to read all of this, but basically this allows us to look at zooplankton abundance, looks at what are the different larvae that are there, how the benthos is growing, the winter time. There's a resuspension of the pelagic plankton, which I think is really important, because these animals in the sediments that I study, they're not just going into hibernation, they're feeding on organisms that is resuspended. So it's a very important activity that goes on. Then you have the spring melt and then the summer. And so I think that important part of that is we have these moorings, sediment traps, and glider systems, let alone the seasonal cruises that we're able to undertake. And then I just want to finish up with to give you a little bit of our sampling that's gone on. We've had these cruises up in here. Have the Sir Wilfrid Laurier went out. We normally go on that, but it was a crew only. This is a COVID impact. We couldn't do any science off of that. On the Oscar Dyson that we're able to send out from the consortium with NOAA. We were only able to do the water column work because of an impact by a COVID-related issue, but they did successfully go all the way from all through and put all 25 moorings in. And this is what Phil Estabano will talk about, the warmer water in the Bering Sea than above normal, and the fact that they were able to do seabird observations and marine mammals on that cruise. The Norseman went out, Rebecca Woodgate went only with the crew, and what she was able to turn those moorings around. The Japanese are out there now. They're doing 2 of the DBO lines. The Louis St. Laurent is working in the Canada Basin. primarily with only Canadians, and a very small team on that. No US participants allowed. Then we're going out on the Norseman. We'll be doing, we've got, we're going to be doing the observing system, the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, and the CEO. All of those is part of it with the consortium of funding for doing that. We'll run those lines from south of St. Lawrence Island all the way up to Utiavik. And then then Bob Picard is following up and working the Beaufort Sea. He'll do a few of these lines on the DBO and actually do the only DBO 6 line in the Beaufort, and then follow that up on the Seculia. So this is what we will be doing when we leave tomorrow. Right now it's up in the air. We're planning to go south and then work our way up, work the DBO 3, come up, depending on whaling that's going on, come and do DBO 5, then 4. If time allows, we'll pull a mooring for NOAA over here, head back down, run some stations across Bering Strait, and come back. But the weather's turning, and which means we might have to do a reversal, and this is something we'll have to decide tomorrow. You can see the measurements that are we have, everything from water column. We'll be doing physics, chemistry, biology, benthos, the harmful algal blooms, and also running some experiments. And it's a consortium of projects, as I've mentioned, including the ecofoci part for a mooring down in the DBO1 area. And then what Phyllis will talk about, Stabeno from PMEL NOAA in Seattle, will be some of the results from the crews that just came back after their 40 days. That actually the Dyson is still punching against weather to try to get back to Oregon. But they were able to turn around all these blue moorings you can see here. So it was the one ship that went out as a joint program in NOAA, turned those moorings around, was able to get these moorings, I should point out, and I'm sure Phyllis will too, right on the international dateline with Russia and the US, which has fishery capability and fisheries acoustics on them, as well as the physical oceanography. And then you can see these went all the way up here, and these moorings were turned around. So it's a very deep one also that up in the, that's important for deep water measurements in the, down on the base of the slope into the basin here, and then swung back down.
And Jackie, this is Gay. I'm just going to give a plug for Phyllis because
Good.
she's on Straight Science next week at this time, October 8th. And she's going to be providing, Jackie's kind of giving the prep, and then Phyllis is going to come in and actually give sort of the first peek. We're really lucky to have her want to present to NOAA, and she'll be giving some of the first results for this particular survey where you've got information coming on where all these blue dots and green dots and whatnot, or where the station stops and gets samples from. So very, and this is one of the few research cruises that's been able to go out. So we're all looking forward to that. That's next Thursday. Thanks,
Right.
Jackie.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good point. And
Hang on, Jackie. I think I muted you. And I can't seem to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
That's okay, Gay. I get the idea. So I'm
No,
almost
I'm
done.
trying to mute myself. Thanks.
So anyway, there's a nice composite and a lot of, from zooplankton to all the work that's been done, a lot of the information. Phyllis is pretty excited. They were sending off a lot of the physical oceanography data she's been able to look at in the sea ice. So I think that'll be a really good talk for you all to listen to. And then, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. There's a lot of funding sources on all the data that I brought forward, planning that we're doing, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Do you want me to end and then stop sharing?
Well, you can stop sharing. That's always good. It makes you bigger on the screen for the people that are watching. And if there's a question, you can always jump right back into share your screen. Lots of hand claps coming up from the Zoom professionals that we now have. So you're getting lots of hand clapping and very good. So thank you. That's, if you want to join in on that, you go down to your bottom bar and you go to reactions, and you can give it the clap.
Oh, you're so nice.
Thumbs up. There we go.
So there was a question from Seth. I think it'll be a different Zoom link, right, Kay?
Correct. So there'll be a different zoom length. The UAF likes to have different zoom lengths because, you know, there's so many people that might want to bomb in on straight science. We do it that way just to keep things private, professional. So yes, there'll be a different link and it'll be sent out on the flyers. And I guess we're still in the learning stages as to how to get that out to like CFOS and stuff. So I'll make sure that happens now that there's an interest. So thank you for that. Any questions immediately for Jackie? I know I've got a question or two, but just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm gonna come and join you there, Jackie.
Hey.
So great. So people don't seem to have questions at this time, maybe taking it all in. And what I got out of the presentation, which was awesome, was that with the loss of sea ice, there's several things that we seem to be systematically seeing in the northern Bering Sea right on through if you go up in your distributed biological observatory stations that you have going from south to north. So that's that the Bering, the northern Bering Sea shelf water is 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it should be. Is that my understanding? And that's at the bottom.
Yeah, that was on the bottom. I mean, you see this on the surface, but that came off the Dyson cruise. I think that Phyllis will really hit that because that's extremely warm compared to the normal, which means the water column is warm from bottom to top, which means you're not going to build ice as fast.
Yeah. And so that's what we're down to the ice currently, whole Arctic over the top. If you look at the north, you look at outer space, go down to the North Pole and kind of look out there. We have as much ice as less ice than we did in 2012, which is the record at this point. So we've kind of broken that record and are crawling back to try to get the Arctic back at least above 2012 levels. Our air temperatures out here are warm. It was 50 degrees today. We've got, sounds like you've got less clams and amphipods and all the worms on the south of St. Lawrence Island are maybe lower in number and changing their range. And you're getting more clams and things sort of heading north, following, I don't know whether it's getting away from the warm water, but are transitioning up.
Right, and I think
the warm water maybe.
Right, well, no, one of the things is that these animals have a range. You know, they can take cold temperatures, really cold, freezing, below freezing, and they can take a maximum. But what's influencing a lot south of St. Lawrence Island, the water column production has gone down. I mean, that's what we're seeing from satellites there. The north of Bering Strait, the production has gone up, open water system, so there's more organic carbon hitting the bottom there, so there's more food for these clams too. So where you've got, so food is a big player on, and where that food lands down and on this conveyor belt will influence the type of organisms that can utilize that food. So that's part of what that northward south difference is that where the production is hitting the bottom.
Right, and people in this region are very familiar with all water heading north out of the Bering Sea into the.
That's right, and the thing is too is that the last time I was in Nome, you know, when the talks were about with the Pacific cod, yeah, in January, the Pacific cod, you know, these guys all like to eat a lot of the benthic acid. So now there's competitors for what is usually the cold temperatures have kept these big mouth predators on the bottom out, except for gray whales and walruses that are only periodically go there. Now you have the big mouth cod, and even pollock are feeding off the bottom. So they're now they're competing with a lot of these upper trophic organisms. And these animals take a while to grow, the ones on the bottom.
Right, and I'd like to sort of call it a predator pit of predatory, commercially viable, large-bodied fish, like pollock and Pacific cod. Those are here more than they would normally be.
And then you have a Russian, they're fishing up in the western part of the Chukchi, right? And you have longline fishing in the north of St. Lawrence Island. And
we have new developments on both sides of the line with fisheries. Of course, U.S. fisheries can only occur from a line drawn basically from Diomede to Wales. That can only be in U.S. waters for U.S. fleet. They can't go above that latitude, so they can't go north of Wales. Now, the Russian side, of course, that's their own exclusive economic zone, and they manage it differently, so they can. they absolutely can do what they want to do in their side of the line, but we're pretty tight here, tightly linked. And so what we're seeing is, as far as all these things, is that you're starting to see the marine mammals. Maybe we're getting some issues with numbers of elevated strandings, not so much this year, but in the last 2 years. The seabirds, of course, multi-species die-off has been documented up here. So those are maybe in response to that northward movement of the fish due to the lack of warm water or lack of cold water barrier.
They're going to keep going north as long as they can.
And then you've got I'm glad you brought up the harmful algal blooms. So those have gone, and those cysts settle in the sediments, and those are dormant right now. They can be good for 100 years. And when the water gets warm enough up there, up north, those can start growing. And that would make a large amount of algae potentially that could bloom and have a bit of a problem perhaps for some of the mammals.
Right. Right. And I think that's the whole thing about that HAB network, is because you have the death, unfortunately, and the Aleutians, and people consume these, clams and snails and so forth. And so I know there has to be, the information along the coastal communities of what this means at certain times of the year, because it's common in Florida and parts of the, the Atlantic side and, where in the Gulf of Mexico, where you have these harmful algal blooms that get real widespread.
So here's my 2 questions with all that preamble from me. Sorry about that. Was one, have we ever been here before? Is there any evidence that we've been in this position before where we've lost our cold water and this ecosystem kind of is rolling from the southern Bering Sea, kind of rolling right on through into the Bering Strait region, and to the southern Chukchi? So have we ever been here before? And the other would be, is this at all seem like we can reverse this? With
I'll take the last one is, look at, we have the second lowest sea ice on the record. And I think we have, looking at the maps, we started off with this talk, it's just the water keeps getting warmer and warmer, from the surface water in the Bering Sea. The Bering Strait used to be land, so so you've got a point there. So that used to not be the Bering Strait, right? And it used to be all the area, the Chirikov used to be just the bridge to go across. So, you're looking at that kind of time frame that play in there. And as far as whether we're going to turn this around, the look is that this is not going to, we might have oscillations, but we always knew that you'd oscillate more and more as you start getting the step function change, this quote new normal that gets presented out. It's just that the last decade has just been getting warmer, unless we have a way to really turn that freezer on up north and in the south. Because right now with so little ice up there, every winter we start building ice, but you don't build the multi-year ice. You don't build as much. You have a lot longer to go before you bring it down on the shelf. And you have to cool all that warm water, and then all of a sudden you turn around and unless we change our rotation of the axis, we're going to have spring and you're going to have winter time. So, the way it's looking, it doesn't seem like it. I wouldn't be surprised to have some oscillations, but the fact that, that's what happens when you get a step function, you change and change, and then you figure out a new level, but it's not looking like, from the, with the climate change that we're having now, the warming water, the changes that are going on, and the push out of nearly 2/3 of all the ice in the Arctic, that it'd be really hard to go back to what we had in the 80s, 70s. But I'd let Seth, who's sitting on here, say his 2 cents on something if he wants to.
Seth, you're being called out. You want to respond or provide any input on this one?
Sure, I'll jump in just a little. Yeah, we did some analyses earlier this year, and these are certainly from the observational record, which in the Chukchi Sea goes back to 1922. The Bering Sea observational record starts a little bit later. We haven't seen anything like this before, but some of Rick Toman's work has shown that you really can't get the type of warming we've seen in the last couple of years without the human-induced warmings caused, that got kicked off by the Industrial Revolution. Really, you can't explain the type of weather patterns and the type of climate that we have right now without this anthropogenic warming.
Thanks, Seth.
And there was, I would just add well, if anybody has more questions on that, otherwise there's a question I wanted to address.
There is a question in the chat I'll read out, but or you want to?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. I know if anything more, what Seth, I think that's the important point. Seth summarized it just quite nicely.
All right.
The question in here, the question in here was the chat box, was the fact that I didn't bring up is that I do have pictures, and I think many of you saw the wash up of tons of krill.
Can I just read it? Because we do have someone that's joining by telephone.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if they're watching or if they can see the chat box, but the chat, I'm sure they're, maybe they can if they're watching.
I'm watching, Gay. It's Rafaela from up north.
Oh, Rafaela. Okay.
Hi, Rafaela. Yeah, so she had the question. Yeah, go ahead. You want to read it, Gay? I can just say.
Rafaela, why don't you go ahead and just ask your question?
Well, I'll go ahead and.
So yeah, Jackie just answered. So my question was about the significant krill end of August to mid-September, Kaktovik to Barrow, washing up, bowheads, aggregating, Harrison Bay, of these, lots of food out there. So just curious on your perspective of that.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that photo, Rafael. It's amazing to see the amount of krill. And I would just point out that right off of Utqiagvik, I think it was about 6 miles to the east of it, one of our DBO stations picked up the highest krill content was on the bottom. So it was coming from upstream to downstream. So your question, is it coming in? We think it's, the words I've had of people I talked to, that it's coming in from the south and being vected and coming around Barrow. And then that whole krill trap that Karen Ashton and Steve Okinen and Sue Moore, how the winds change one direction or the other, you get a kind of a corralling of that krill. And I think it washed up on the North Slope there that allows those bowheads then to really take advantage of that. So I think that krill trap part is really played well this year. But what I've heard is that the feeling is that these krill are actually coming from the south, and we've documented actually on our cameras, seeing them scurrying around, swarming along the bottom, being advected north, the idea being they advected northward. So I don't think it fully can say it's not because the fact that you had better ice there, but I think that at least the fact that the krill are there is probably because they're coming from the south. That's what I heard.
No, thank you. And the reason why, I wanted to bring it up because the whalers commented on the abundance of it. And also, I've been, involved in whaling up here, or at least in the harvest for quite a while. And I don't recall, having seen stomachs that were, just filled to the brim. I mean, there wasn't liquid, right? This was solid, mass, and, and whalers were, talking specifically about it, that it actually, washed up into the Alsen Lagoon, right? You could actually, so it was backtracking kind of, and showing up there. And so, so it was considered to be, at least it's my impression that I got, that it was really significant, right? And Billy spoke about that it was like, the water was red. And so, I've heard of the krill trap before, but I've never, I guess it was maybe never as visible, from people from all the way from Kaktovik, Cross Island, and Barrow. So I'm just curious about, also because of the, the direness in the Bering Strait, that if all of this food is still coming up here, that's maybe not the greatest thing. But so thanks for answering that.
Right, and I would just point out that we do have because I co-chair the Marine Ecosystem Collaborative Team for IARPIC, which is the interagency. We're going to have a webinar by Karen, Steve, and Sue in October on that krill trap. So it's another virtual meeting, but that'll be just focused specifically on that potential, on that modeling and what the findings. And I did send Steve the CTD profiles from where we were seeing the most krill across Barrow Canyon. So he'll be looking at that too.
That's cool. And then just a follow up, because I've been sharing it with Gay. So, so lately what's actually washing up is, and it's not that much, but, I walk the beach a lot because I get a dog, like rocks, and it's COVID-19. So I do a lot of walking. you know, lately it's small amphipods that are washing up, and they're all alive.
Huh.
And
Okay.
again, you know, for me, that's something, I've seen amphipods, you know, whatever, on stinker whales, you know, or on, you know, or meat that's being left out, you know, and then brought in. So, but I just thought again that for me it was interesting, and they're about, you know, I guess, you know, half an inch big. And again, I was like, wow, I don't recall, you know, seeing that. Now, again, take it was the, you know, was the grain of salt of saying, you know, I'm talking about maybe 10 years of experience up here. But I thought it was interesting that we first had a krill, and now we have these little amphipods washing
Right.
up.
Yeah, I think that's real interesting because I remember talking to some locals up there about when the winds changed and the currents around the spit there, that the gray whales would be feeding on one side or the other near shore, because you know they do come to get some of those benthic infaunal animals, that they would just come out because of the change of current, and then they would be consuming them. And gray whales will feed on these krill too. So it's an interesting biological, and getting more statements, getting more information like this from what you see is great.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, any other questions for Jackie? Well, I would say, so Jackie, one other question that might be appropriate for you to talk about in Nome, or what are the, we have really not had research vessels come to the Port of Nome for this summer for good reason. And I know this is a cruise that wasn't planned very far in advance, so we understand why, you know, things are what they are, but you might want to just let people in Nome know maybe some of the precautions
Sure.
that you've taken.
Right. Yeah, there's a whole COVID policy that the Norseman too has with the state of Alaska and the city of Nome of how to do this. And we actually quarantined most of us for a week when we were lower 48. We had to be tested before we could come in the state of Alaska. We had to quarantine now for a week and you know, in our hotel rooms, and limited in the sense you couldn't go out, you're not supposed to go out for walks and so forth. And we had a second COVID test this week, and so those came back negative. So we have 2 negative tests. We are being we take a charter flight tomorrow up. We don't meet with the community at all. We have the harbor master picking us up, or whoever, in a clean van on the tarmac. So there's been an agreement with the airport folks so that we can actually step out on the tarmac, get in these vans, take them to the ship, get on, and that's our bubble. So we're kind of in this bubble, and we've been in this bubble now for a couple of weeks, except when we got on the airplane, which was very easy to fly up here because nobody's on the planes. But we're in masks, you know, and so we've been very careful, and we will be in masks when we on our way there. So we won't be interfacing. I'll wave at Gay when tomorrow from the.
Yeah, I'll
we'll
see
be on the
you
dock.
from a good social distance.
Right, and so that's how it was done. There was no commercial flight to come up there. It was this charter flight.
So thank you, Jackie, because I know that is a lot of logistics and a lot of extra expense, and I think that is much appreciated by everyone in.
Oh, sure.
Because we are having some difficulties in northern and western Alaska right now with COVID has.
Right, and that's one of the reasons we can't do our, we can't do our visits that we have. We went out to St. Lawrence Island in January, but that our plan to go up to the North Slope, and that went out the window. Right. And then our ability to go on ships that we normally could come off, we can't do that now. So that's one reason why we will go up and do this and come back down and leave. And we wish all go normal next year.
Well, we're all wishing for that. And so, Jackie, I hope we see you we will see you maybe tomorrow from afar. I'm not kidding, but hopefully we'll see a lot of the people that are on this call under easier circumstances. So I want to thank you. And I also want to wish you well. Tomorrow, I was just looking while you were giving your talk. So Anchorage, to get out of Anchorage, starting at 4 a.m., it's going to ramp up to 45 miles an hour, 45 to 65 mile an hour with gusts to 80. So I think it's time to get out of Anchorage.
Yeah, that's why they moved it up. We'll see whether or not we do, but they moved up the flight. Yeah,
I bet they did. And Nome is for as far as your ship and everything. Nome's the winds are going to be out of the northeast, which is about as good as you can get from here, because that'll damp the waves. So things ought to be pretty stable given the port situation. So don't stress on that too much. As long as it holds northeast, that would be really good.
Good.
And with that, Jackie, if you want to stay on the line, I'm going to turn off. If there's anything else, anybody have anything for Jackie? All right, we wish you well. Safe sailing. You're